Do you believe that a single act of kindness can change a life? That one moment, one choice, can set off a chain reaction leading to something unimaginable? The city was merciless. Towering skyscrapers loomed over the streets, casting long shadows over cracked pavements and alleys filled with echoes of forgotten souls. Neon lights flickered against the wet asphalt, reflecting a world that never seemed to sleep yet remained indifferent to those who suffered within it. Aisha pulled her thin coat tighter around her shoulders as the cold wind cut through the night. It was late, too late, but she had no choice. After finishing her dishwashing shift at a rundown diner on 6th Street, she had to deliver newspapers before dawn to scrape together enough money for rent and food. She had long since grown used to the exhaustion clawing at her bones, the emptiness of her stomach a constant reminder of her reality. The world had never been kind to her. At 17, she had learned that dreams were a luxury she couldn't afford. Her mother had died when she was young, leaving behind only faded photographs and the scent of lavender that still lingered in the old apartment. Her father, once a proud man, was now just a name on prison records. A mistake had stolen him away from her, and society had made sure she never forgot it. But Aisha didn't complain. She worked, she survived, and she kept moving forward. Because what else could she do? As she trudged down the icy sidewalk, something caught her eye. A figure standing motionless in the middle of the street. Cars honked angrily as they swerved around him, drivers yelling curses before speeding off into the night. But the man didn't react. He just stood there, clutching a crumpled piece of paper in his shaking hands, his silver hair disheveled, his coat too thin for the freezing night. His eyes darted around in confusion, as if searching for something he had lost, yet unable to remember what it was. Aisha hesitated. People ignored him, just as they ignored all the other broken souls wandering this city. She could do the same. Walk away, pretend she never saw him. After all, she had enough problems of her own. Then it happened. A car came barreling down the road, headlights blinding in the darkness. The old man didn't move. He didn't see it. Without thinking, Aisha ran. She barely reached him in time, grabbing his arm and yanking him back onto the sidewalk just as the car sped past, its tires screeching against the wet road. Her heart pounded violently in her chest. "Are you okay?" she asked, breathless. The man blinked at her, his face a mixture of fear and confusion. He looked down at the paper in his hands, then back at her, his lips quivering. I don't know where I am," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how I got here." Aisha frowned. She studied him more closely now, the fine lines on his face, the weary sadness in his eyes. He wasn't just any homeless man. His clothes, though wrinkled, were of good quality. His shoes, scuffed but sturdy, were the kind that didn't belong to someone who had lived on the streets for years. "Do you have someone I can call?" she asked. He shook his head, looking lost. Then, slowly, he unfolded the paper in his hand and held it out to her. It was an address, hastily scribbled, but it was clear enough to read. Aisha's stomach clenched. She recognized the neighborhood. It was across the city, far from here. Too far to walk, especially for someone in his condition. She reached into her pocket, feeling the few crumpled bills she had left. Barely enough for food. Definitely not enough for both of them to take a cab. She had two choices. She could leave him here, hope that someone else would help him. Hope that, somehow, he would find his way home on his own. Or she could take him there herself, even if it meant spending what little money she had and going hungry another night. Aisha took a deep breath, then pulled off her own thin scarf and wrapped it around his trembling shoulders. She had made her decision. "Come on," she said, gripping his hand. "I'll take you home." The city remained indifferent as they walked, the neon lights flickering overhead, the cold wind howling through empty streets. But in that moment, Aisha knew something had shifted. A choice had been made, a path set in motion. And though she didn't know it yet, that night would change her life forever. Aisha tightened her grip on the old man's hand as they navigated the city streets. The night felt colder now, the wind sharper against her skin, but she ignored it. The man, Samuel, as he had finally recalled, walked with unsteady steps, his fingers trembling even beneath her firm grasp. His confusion had not lifted. In fact, it seemed to deepen with every passing minute. She glanced at the address again. It was far, too far to walk in this freezing weather. The buses had stopped running for the night, and a taxi would cost more than she could afford. Her stomach growled, a bitter reminder of what little money she had left. Samuel let out a soft sigh. I used to know this city," he murmured. "I worked here, raised my family here. But now, it's all so unfamiliar." Aisha studied him from the corner of her eye. His voice carried a sadness she recognized, the kind of loneliness that settled deep into the bones. It wasn't just the cold that made him shiver. It was fear. She spotted a diner at the corner of the next block, its neon sign buzzing weakly in the darkness. Without a second thought, she led him inside. The warmth wrapped around them immediately, chasing away the chill of the night. Aisha dug into her pocket, pulling out a few crumpled bills. Just enough for a hot drink and something small to eat. She walked up to the counter and placed the order. Samuel sat across from her in the booth, staring down at his hands as if searching for something lost within the wrinkles of his skin. When the waitress placed the steaming cup of coffee and a small sandwich in front of him, he hesitated. "I don't," he faltered, blinking. "Did I bring money?" Aisha pushed the cup closer to him. "Don't worry about it," she said. "Just eat." He nodded slowly, wrapping his frail fingers around the cup. The warmth seemed to bring a bit of clarity back into his eyes. He took a sip, sighing deeply as if the heat seeped into something more than just his body. For a moment they sat in silence. The diner was mostly empty except for a tired-looking cook behind the counter and a lone truck driver hunched over his plate at the far end of the room. The world outside felt distant, as though they were suspended in this small pocket of warmth and quiet. Then Samuel spoke. "You're very kind, young lady." Aisha shrugged. I know what it's like to feel lost." His eyes met hers then, and for a fleeting second, something like recognition flickered in them. Not of her, but of the pain she carried. "I had a daughter," he said suddenly, his voice trembling. "She was about your age when she left home for college. Smart girl. Always told me she'd make the world better." Aisha swallowed the lump in her throat. "Where is she now?" Samuel's brow furrowed. He set the coffee down, his fingers tapping restlessly against the table. I don't remember." His voice cracked. "I don't remember her name." Aisha looked away, blinking back the sting in her own eyes. Alzheimer's. It was stealing him piece by piece, erasing his memories one by one. She couldn't imagine what that felt like, to have your own life slip through your fingers like sand. He let out a shaky breath. "You remind me of her, not in looks, but in spirit." Aisha forced a small smile. "Well, if she's anything like me, I bet she's out there helping someone right now." A shadow of a smile touched his lips, but it didn't last long. The confusion returned, his gaze drifting to the window, watching the city lights blur into the darkness. Aisha checked the time. They couldn't stay here forever. She made a decision. "Come on," she said, standing up. "Let's get you home." It was a long walk. The cold gnawed at her skin, but she ignored it. Samuel was growing weaker with each step, exhaustion weighing heavily on him. Aisha had to stop twice to let him rest, leaning him against street lamps while she rubbed his arms to keep his circulation going. At one point, she saw a group of teenagers on the corner, their laughter sharp and mocking as they passed by. One of them, a boy no older than her, glanced at her and scoffed. "Hey girl, you talking in strays now?" he sneered. Aisha shot him a glare but said nothing. She had long since learned that words meant nothing to people like him. Samuel, oblivious to the exchange, clung to her arm as they kept moving forward. The address loomed ahead, a house that stood in stark contrast to the city's rough edges. It was large, well-kept, with a manicured lawn and lights glowing warmly from inside. Aisha hesitated at the gate. Samuel stared at the house, his expression unreadable. Then, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the crumpled piece of paper again, staring at it as if searching for an answer. Aisha sighed and stepped forward. She rang the doorbell. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, footsteps. The door swung open, revealing a middle-aged woman, her eyes red and weary. When she saw Samuel, her breath hitched. "Dad!" Samuel blinked, his lips parting. He took a step forward, then another, his body trembling. Not from the cold this time, but from something deeper. "Emma!" The woman let out a choked sob and rushed forward, wrapping her arms around him. "Oh my God, Dad! We've been looking everywhere for you." Aisha took a step back, watching as the pieces finally fell into place. Emma held onto her father as if afraid he would disappear again, whispering reassurances into his ear. Then she turned to Aisha, her eyes brimming with gratitude. Did you bring him here?" Aisha nodded. "He was lost downtown. I just helped him find his way back." Emma wiped at her tears, shaking her head in disbelief. "I thank you. Thank you so much." She disappeared inside for a moment, then returned with a coat draped over her arm. "Please come in. You must be freezing." Aisha hesitated. This wasn't her world. This wasn't her home. But before she could say anything, Samuel turned to her. "You're a good girl," he murmured. "A good heart." Aisha smiled, swallowing the lump in her throat. "Take care of yourself, Samuel." She turned to leave, the cold night wrapping around her once more. She didn't expect what happened next. Just as she reached the sidewalk, a car pulled up to the driveway, its headlights cutting through the darkness. The driver stepped out, holding a sealed envelope. "Wait!" Emma called after her. "Please don't go yet." Aisha turned, confused. The driver approached, handing her the envelope. "The Bennett family wanted to thank you." Aisha frowned, glancing at Emma. "I didn't do this for money." Emma smiled softly. "I know, but open it anyway." Aisha hesitated before peeling it open. Inside was a scholarship letter and a check. More money than she had ever seen in her life. Her hands trembled. For the first time in years, a new possibility unfolded before her. She looked up at the house, at Samuel, at Emma, and for the first time she allowed herself to dream. The luxury car pulled away, its red taillights fading into the misty night. Aisha stood at the entrance of her crumbling apartment building, clutching the envelope in her hands. She could feel the weight of it, not just in paper and ink, but in the promise of something she had never dared to dream of. A future, a way out. She slowly opened it, her fingers trembling. The first thing she saw was a letter, written in elegant cursive. Dear Aisha, you have done something extraordinary today, not just for my father, but for all of us. In a world where people walk past suffering without a second glance, you chose to stop. You chose kindness. You have reminded us of the power of humanity. Enclosed is a small token of our gratitude. May it be the first step toward the brilliant future you deserve. Tears blurred her vision as she pulled out a second piece of paper. It was a scholarship, a full ride to one of the best universities in the state. She gasped, pressing a hand to her mouth. The final thing in the envelope was a check, a sum of money so large she had to blink twice to make sure she wasn't imagining it. Enough to cover rent for years, enough to buy warm meals, enough to give her father the lawyer he needed. Her legs felt weak. She sank onto the steps, letting the cold night air wrap around her. For so long she had fought alone, struggled to keep her head above water. And now, for the first time, the current had shifted in her favor. The next morning, she took a deep breath and stepped into the small, dimly lit lawyer's office. She placed the check on the desk, her voice steady for the first time in a long while. I want to help my father. Months passed. The city remained the same. Tall, gray, indifferent. But something within Aisha had changed. The weight of constant struggle had begun to lift. She walked through the same streets, but now she walked with purpose. Her father's case was reopened. With a better lawyer, with proper evidence, the truth had a chance to be heard. And one crisp autumn afternoon, Aisha stood outside the prison gates, watching as the man she had missed for so long stepped out, free at last. His eyes, tired yet filled with hope, locked onto hers. You did this? He whispered, disbelief in his voice. She nodded, her throat too tight to speak. And then he hugged her, holding her the way he used to when she was a little girl afraid of the dark. I'm so proud of you, sweetheart. Tears rolled down her cheeks, but for the first time, they weren't tears of pain. They were tears of relief, of hope, of a life finally turning a corner. One evening, months later, she found herself walking past the same alleyway where she had first seen Mr. Bennett. The city was just as cold, just as ruthless, but she was different now, stronger, more sure of herself. And as she walked past a homeless man shivering on the sidewalk, she stopped. She pulled off her scarf, the same one she had wrapped around Mr. Bennett, and gently draped it over the man's shoulders. Stay warm, she said, giving him a small smile before walking away. Kindness is never wasted. It may not always return in the way we expect, but it always finds a way back. Aisha's story is a reminder that even in the darkest of places, even when life seems unforgiving, the smallest act of compassion can change everything. One moment of selflessness can alter the course of a life. Sometimes it even saves one. And perhaps the biggest lesson of all, you never know when a small act of kindness will come back to you in the most unexpected way. If you love this story, don't miss the next one. An even more powerful tale about resilience and hope. Click subscribe and follow the channel now.